The Ancestral Trail, Book 15, Narkum, the Fly King. First published by Marshall Cavendish, 1993. Based on a story by Frank Graves. In desperation, Richard, Orcan and Melek ran for the forest. They had to find cover fast. The Grapfrits drone was reaching fever pitch. They reached the trees just in time, but there was nowhere to hide. Gnarled trunks rose like tortured limbs from the bare earth and staggered into the gloomy distance. Behind the fleeing trio, the Grapfrits drone took on a deeper note. The swarm had entered the forest. Richard had all but given up hope when he spotted a dark chink at the base of a large tree. The three made for it, thinking there might be somewhere to hide amongst the tangled roots. To their amazement, they found a small door set into the roots, which had made their way up through the earth and were exposed to the air. It was old and mildewed, and the surrounding timbers sagged in all directions. It was the only possible refuge, so Richard pushed on the door to see if it would open. It was stuck fast. Then Orcan threw his weight against it, and the door slowly creaked open. The three piled through the doorway and pressed themselves into the shadows. Outside, the Grapfrits buzzed their way between the tree trunks. With their poor sight, they did not see the three duck silently through the ancient door. The Grapfrits heard no movement at all, and to them this meant that their prey had moved on. They picked up speed and screamed past the hideout like a meteor shower, pursuing the figments of their own imaginations. Behind the door, the three waited until the drone had died away before they dared move. Richard let out his breath in a gasp. "We were lucky there," he said, "but we best stay put for a while in case they come back for a second sweep." He looked around. It was dark inside the tree, and far bigger than it had seemed from the outside. Then he noticed a glow coming from deeper inside the tree, and a smell that reminded him of rotting meat. "On second thoughts, we don't want to hang around any longer than we have to," Richard said louder than he had meant to. "We'll have a quick look at the prophecy, and then we'll move on." Melek carried the book over to the door, which let in just enough light for them to be able to read the faded text.
Flying foes are everywhere, on the ground and in the air. Hidden from the light of day, a place to stop but not to stay. Here countless dark eyes will see you, and the burning flames will free you. But a false friend will deceive you. Your hidden treasure will leave you.
Richard thought about the words for a moment, but they did not seem much help. The flying foes were obviously the Grapfrits, but what the riddle meant about them being on the ground as well as in the air, Richard could not fathom. He had a shrewd idea who the treacherous friend referred to, although without any hard evidence he hesitated to make an accusation. One line certainly did make perfect sense. A place to stop but not to stay fits this hovel down in the ground. "It's time to leave," Richard told the others. They pulled at the door, which seemed to be smaller than any of them could remember. As they pulled harder, it seemed to shrink further still, making the tree even darker than it already was.
"I don't think you want to leave just yet."
The harsh words came from deep in the bowels of the tree, causing the three to spin round in terror. Peering into the gloom, they realized the voice came from behind the glow. Then they saw an enormous fly. Its blue-green body was partially covered with a forest of thick black hair. Its arms ended in sharp claws. A thin tongue licked horribly from the black funnel of its mouth. Everything about the creature exuded darkness, except for its eyes. They were enormous and sparkled with a myriad prisms that seemed to reflect light from an uncanny depth. Staring at them, Richard had the impression that they held images not just of the room they were in, but of places very far away. The eyes were hypnotic. Richard felt that if he looked into the eyes for too long, he would be sucked into a crystalline maze where nothing existed save flashing pictures of a distant world. He tore his gaze away, distracted by another glimmer of light. It came from a sceptre that the fly gripped in one of its black talons. The rod's elaborately carved head was encrusted with jewels cut to resemble its owner's eyes. They glinted and shone in the firelight as the fly casually turned the rod in its claw. The three gaped spellbound at the apparition before them. Now and then a small cloud of flies flew up to the hideous creature, communicating with it in high-pitched buzzing before disappearing back into the darkness. Richard was reminded of a general receiving reports from a battlefront. The monstrous fly sat impassively as it held the trio in its gaze. Richard shook himself to break the spell. "Come on, let's cut our way out of here," he said, drawing his dagger and turning to the door. As the three headed for freedom, the giant fly raised its sceptre. Instantly, a thick cloud of flies descended upon them. The trio fought valiantly against the onslaught, but it was an impossible task. For every few flies they managed to swat, hundreds more took their place. The air was black with insects, when Richard suddenly thought of the cloak that Golan had given him. Invisibility was perhaps the only way out. He drew the hood over his head and experienced that familiar blurring sensation before his sight cleared. This time the old magic failed. While Richard himself became invisible, his figure was clearly outlined because of the thousands of flies which clung onto him. He looked at his hand. It was covered in a living glove of flies. The air grew thicker by the second, and soon the three companions were completely enclosed in a solid block of black bodies. "Come closer." The rough voice reached the trio indistinctly. At the same time, the flies withdrew, opening a path which led back to the dark figure on the other side of what they now saw were glowing embers. It raised a claw and beckoned them forward. Richard flung back his hood and shimmied back into sight. "Come closer." The giant fly beckoned, wielding its sceptre again. From behind, a cloud of smoke formed into a flying fist that gently urged them forwards. "Who are you?" Richard demanded. "What do you want with us?" "I am Narkum, the Fly King and Spy Master, and you are the chosen one." The giant fly raised a claw and pointed at each companion in turn. "You are Golan's minions, feeble pawns who have been duped into certain death by the honeyed tongue of one who claims to be good." Narkum's laughter swirled like ball bearings on a kettle drum. "Golan? Never heard of him," Richard threw back defiantly. "We were crossing the forest when we were attacked by Grapfrits. You've got no cause to hold us. We've no grudge against you." He tried to bluff their way out. "You will have soon," Narkum snickered. "You see, I know everything about you and your worthless quest. My spies are everywhere in this realm. They see all and report back to me. I know everything that happens here." His eyes fired for an instant. "And in other worlds, too. Your lives are mine from beginning to end." He paused to let his words sink in, his eyes shining deeper than ever. "No!" Richard cried, letting his anger boil over. Drawing the dagger he had sheathed only a few minutes earlier, he lunged at the Fly King. Throughout Narkum's speech, Orcan had been nervously fingering his amulet. When his friend dived at Narkum, he moved to stop him. His foot shot out, tripping Richard and sending him sprawling to the floor. He almost fell into the glowing embers, which seemed to be getting hotter and brighter. Narkum laughed triumphantly. While his attention had been focused on Richard and Orcan, the Fly King had neglected Melek. Even before Narkum's hollow chuckle rang out, the scribe was circling to one side of the fire. As Richard fell, Melek made his move. He whirled his trusty rope towards the sceptre and tugged it from Narkum's hand. The gleaming rod spun across the room, bouncing off the opposite wall, and it fell with a fragile clatter. Several of the jewelled eyes shattered on impact. Immediately the swarms of flies dropped to the floor, where they lay on their backs, buzzing helplessly. Richard looked around. The air had suddenly cleared. The door was open. A black carpet of flies covered the floor. Richard's eyes locked with Narkum's. Every colour in the spectrum flashed across the Fly King's all-seeing orbs. Visions of eternity clashed and collided before being replaced by a deep-seated fire of hatred. The reflection of the embers expanded into a fierce ruby light that was aimed directly at Richard. He ducked as if to avoid a laser beam. Behind him, a wooden pole charred and cracked under Narkum's gaze. There was no escape from this one, Richard realised. They had to kill the Fly King, or at least destroy his power. "Get the sceptre!" he shouted to Orcan, who was nearest. "Throw it onto the fire!" Orcan was moving in a daze. The amulet's spell held him again, and his only thought was to save his own skin. He stumbled towards the door. Melek rushed to block Orcan's way. He snatched the lumbering warrior's sword from his hands and darted back to the fallen sceptre. Instinctively he knew not to pick it up in his hands. Instead he used Orcan's sword to flip it into the glowing embers. Narkum's voice cracked in a screech of fear as he saw his precious sceptre heading towards the flames. He scurried forward to save it, his black talons stretched into the embers to snatch back the sceptre. Narkum's claw closed around its prize, but in that moment of victory the jewelled rod caught fire. A sheet of flame lit up the room, filling the farthest corner with unaccustomed brightness. Narkum stood transfixed, a starburst radiating from his outstretched arm. Then the flames took hold, lapping greedily over his whole body. For a moment Narkum's fathomless eyes stared at Melek through the flames. Then the fire licked upwards, and their glassy surface blackened and cracked, emitting delicate popping noises as their secrets disappeared into oblivion. Richard ran for the door, followed closely by Melek. Orcan was already halfway through. After them crawled a carpet of flies, too weak to fly, but alert enough to sense that if they stayed inside, they would surely die. Outside, the trio flung themselves to the ground. At the same time, Narkum's body exploded. It did so with a boom that sent hurricane blast waves sweeping through the farthest reaches of the forest. The tree disintegrated in a shower of soft wood that sprayed harmlessly over Richard and his friends. Many of the flies, being lighter and weaker, were flattened against nearby trees, their lives ending in stains of yellow-white that dripped slowly to the ground. Richard stood up and looked around him in astonishment. The remnants of Narkum's army were undergoing an extraordinary transformation. Those flies that had survived the flames and the blast were changing shape. Their twisted black bodies were splitting open to reveal beautiful, multicoloured insects, which grew bigger by the second, unfurling wide wings that shone with a pearly glow in the forest gloom. The sound of their old skins being shrugged off filled the air with a steady crackle, as if someone was walking through dead leaves. All around him Richard saw antennae twitching, limbs stretching, and wings testing the air. One of the larger insects approached Richard and stared at him intently through eyes that reflected all of the colours of the rainbow. Strangely, Richard felt not the slightest bit afraid. He stood his ground while the creature before him finished its inspection. "You must be the chosen one," it said. "What you see before you is all that remains of the insect race that used to inhabit this world. When the evil one sent Narkum here, we battled hard, but it was useless. His power was too great. Many of us died, and those who survived became his spies. We were his eyes, his ears, keeping track of everything that went on. Bit by bit we watched the forces of good being destroyed, but there was nothing we could do until you came. We are in your debt." Richard absorbed the news, then asked gently, "Do you have any information that could help us?" "Not really. Events move too fast here. In the time since your arrival, anything could have happened. Whatever I told you would be out of date, and you might walk into danger. I can say that many of those who have escaped the Evil One's power have made their way back to the Ancestral City to await your return." Richard's mission seemed to take on an even greater urgency. "Will you be joining forces with the other survivors in the Ancestral City?" he asked. "Yes," the creature replied. "There is no time to waste. Good luck to you." The insect raised one arm as if in salute, then turned to its companions. Now it spoke in a language that Richard could not understand, ordering his followers into squadrons and flights. The insect forces took off, churring the air with their wings. They hovered briefly above the ruined tree before darting off in orderly formations. Richard watched until the last set of glowing wings had been obscured by the trees. Silence descended on the forest. A strange sense of depression fell on him. He reached for Golan's amulet, hoping that it would give him some comfort. It was gone. Richard searched his pockets and patted his clothes with mounting desperation. "The amulet!" he shouted. "It's gone! We have to find it!"
"I saw it."
Orcan spoke in tones as if he was drugged.
"It's in there. Narkum has it, and you can never get it back."
Richard stared at the smouldering trunk. The flames had died down, but the embers still glowed with a fierce heat. He had to find the amulet. Ignoring Melek's pleas, he strode into the red-hot ruins. He could see places where it was safe to walk, or he thought he could. At his third step, the ground flared beneath him in a splash of fire.